What if I told you that the main killer in the open spaces of North America is not the extremely low temperatures? Frost itself is static, and it is relatively easy to insulate yourself from it with several layers of clothing or the walls of your home. The real deadly danger came with air movement, which turns simply cold weather into conditions incompatible with life. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and northern forests spent centuries learning not only to survive in icy winds, but to use their power to their advantage. Dwellings and survival strategies were not primitive shelters, but complex aerodynamic systems honed by generations of experience. Watch the video to the end to learn how Native Americans made the wind work for them, turning a deadly threat into a reliable protector. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the thermometer never shows the real danger on the plains? To understand the genius of Native American defense strategies, you must first understand the nature of the enemy they faced. In the vast expanses of the Great Plains, where there are no natural barriers such as mountains or dense forests, the wind accelerates to tremendous speeds. This airflow does not simply bring cold air from the Arctic. It actively attacks any object that emits heat. The human body constantly heats the thin layer of air around itself, creating an invisible insulating shell. The wind mercilessly strips away this protective warm layer faster than the body can restore it. As a result, the body begins to lose heat at a catastrophic rate, even if the air temperature does not seem extremely low. With a wind speed of 30 kilometers per hour, a frost of -10 degrees feels and affects the skin like -20. If the temperature drops to -20 degrees Celsius and the wind picks up, conditions become deadly in a matter of minutes. Exposed skin in such conditions can get frostbite in less than half an hour. This phenomenon, known today as the wind chill index, was intuitively understood by indigenous peoples at the level of survival. They knew that still air is the best insulator, while moving air steals heat. All their survival techniques were based on one main principle: to stop or slow down the movement of air directly on the body and inside the dwelling. The struggle was not with temperature as such, but with the dynamics of air currents. This required a completely different approach to construction and clothing choices than in regions with a calm climate. Static, thick walls were useless if the wind blew through them. That is why European settlers, accustomed to their own construction methods, often froze in their sturdy but drafty homes. The Indians, on the other hand, using mobile and lightweight structures, felt relatively safe. Their understanding of aerodynamics was not theoretical, but purely practical, paid for by centuries of living in harsh conditions. They learned to read the wind, predict its behavior, and put up barriers exactly where they were needed. Every element of their daily life, from setting up tipis to sewing moccasins, was aimed at sealing and creating areas of calm air. They understood that it was impossible to completely stop the wind, but it was possible to control its flow, forcing it to bypass their living space. It was the art of controlling the invisible forces of nature. Instead of resisting the elements, they integrated themselves into them, minimizing damage. This deep understanding of the physics of wind was fundamental to their survival in winter. Without this knowledge, no amount of food or firewood would have saved the tribe from extinction in the first serious blizzard. Their culture was one of adaptation to the wind, not struggle against it. This difference in approach was key to their successful life on the plains. The understanding that wind kills faster than frost shaped their entire philosophy of life during the winter months. Unnecessary movement in the open air was kept to a minimum so as not to increase heat loss. Travel routes were chosen with prevailing winds in mind to minimize the time spent in the direct path of the elements. All life was subject to the rhythm of the wind, quieting during storms and coming alive during rare hours of calm. We would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced the force of an icy wind when your clothes no longer kept you warm? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this. What if I told you that everything you believed when you saw an Indian tent in a movie is not true, and that it is not just a cone made of animal skins? The tipi of the Plains Indians is one of the most aerodynamically perfect dwellings ever created by man. Its shape is not a perfect geometric cone, but a complex asymmetrical structure specifically designed to withstand strong winds. The back wall of the teepee was always made steeper and shorter than the front, where the entrance was located. This shape was not chosen by chance, but was the result of a long evolution of dwellings in the open steppe. This asymmetry allowed the dwelling to better withstand the prevailing winds, which on the Great Plains most often blew from the west. The teepee was always placed so that its steeper rear part faced the main wind flow. The wind hitting the sloping surface did not press on it with full force, but flowed around it, going up and to the sides. The steep slope did not allow the wind to find a foothold and overturn the structure. If the teepee had been a perfectly symmetrical cone, it would have been much less stable. The wind would have created a low-pressure zone on the leeward side, which could have led to the collapse or failure of the covering. The asymmetrical shape minimized this effect, stabilizing the dwelling even in the strongest storms. It was the same principle used in the modern design of sports cars or airplane wings. The frame of poles also played a huge role in wind resistance. The poles were not simply placed in a teepee shape, but were intertwined at the top with a special knot, creating a rigid, self-supporting structure. 3 or 4 main poles formed a tripod, the most stable engineering figure. The remaining poles were placed in the fork of this tripod, distributing the load evenly around the perimeter. The rope connecting the top of the poles often descended to the center of the dwelling and was attached to a peg driven into the ground. This created additional tension and acted as an anchor, pressing the entire structure to the ground. In particularly strong winds, a heavy load could be suspended from this central rope for additional stabilization. This system allowed the teepee to withstand gusts of wind that easily destroyed the more substantial structures of Europeans. The cover made of sewn bison hides was stretched very tightly over the frame. It did not just hang on the poles, but was literally stretched like a drum with pegs along the bottom edge. The tightly stretched skin did not flap in the wind, which reduced wear and tear on the material and reduced noise inside the dwelling. The smooth surface of the hides also contributed to better airflow. The material itself, thick bison leather, was completely windproof. Unlike fabric tents, the leather did not let in the slightest draft. When wet from rain or wet snow, the hides stretched slightly, and when dry, they contracted, fitting even more tightly around the frame. This made the dwelling a living organism that responded to changes in the weather. The low profile of the dwelling also contributed to its stability. Although the top of the teepee could reach a considerable height, most of its area was close to the ground, where wind speed is always lower due to friction with the surface. Thus, most of the wind load fell on the strongest lower part of the structure. The entire structure was surprisingly flexible. Unlike rigid wooden or stone walls, the frame of a teepee could deform slightly under gusts of wind and then return to its original position. This elasticity was the key to its survival in the prairie storms. Where a rigid wall would crack, the teepee simply bent slightly, dissipating the energy of the wind. Thus, the teepee was not a primitive shelter, but a high-tech aerodynamic device. Its shape, frame construction, and installation method were the perfect response to the challenges of the environment. Do you think such adaptive architecture can be considered more advanced than modern static buildings? Want to know the secret that changes everything about comfort in a teepee? Looking at a teepee from the outside, we see only the outer shell of skins, but the main protection from cold and wind was inside and invisible to the outside eye. This was the so-called inner canopy, or lining, known among some tribes as dewcloth. Without this element, the teepee would have been nothing more than a drafty tent, unsuitable for wintering on the harsh plains. The inner canopy was a wall of softer and more finely crafted skins, usually about 1.5 to 2 meters high. It was suspended from the poles of the frame inside the dwelling around the entire perimeter, starting from the entrance. The lower edge of this canopy was pressed tightly to the ground and often weighed down with things such as beds and bags of supplies, which prevented any drafts from entering at the bottom. The upper edge of the canopy did not reach the top of the teepee, leaving an open space at the top of the dwelling. There was an air gap several centimeters wide between the outer covering of the teepee and this inner canopy. It was this air gap that was the main secret of the dwelling's thermal insulation, working on the principle of modern double-glazed windows or thermoses. Cold air, which inevitably seeped under the lower edge of the outer covering or through the entrance gap, did not enter the living space, but but rather this gap between the two layers of skins. There it was heated by the heat of the central fire, penetrating through the inner canopy. According to the laws of physics, the heated air rushed upward through this channel. This upward flow of warm air in the space between the walls served a dual purpose. First, it created a powerful thermal curtain that insulated the living space from the icy outer shell. The people inside the teepee were surrounded not by a cold outer wall, but by warm air. Secondly, this flow created constant draft. Rising upward and exiting through the smoke hole at the top of the teepee, it carried the smoke from the fire with it. This provided excellent ventilation for the dwelling even when the entrance was closed, without cooling it down. The smoke did not accumulate inside, but immediately rose upward, carried by this air convection. Thanks to the inner canopy, a unique microclimate was created in the teepee. Even when a blizzard raged outside and the temperature dropped to critical levels, a comfortable temperature could be maintained inside. People could sit by the fire without outer clothing, protected from the wind and cold by a double wall and an air gap. This canopy also solved the problem of condensation. In any heated dwelling, moisture from people's breath and the fire condenses on the cold outer walls, turning into frost or dripping water. In a lined teepee, moisture condensed on the inside of the outer cover. Water droplets rolled down the outer skin and drained into the ground outside the living area, which was enclosed by the inner canopy, keeping beds and belongings dry. In winter, the space between the outer skin and the inner canopy was often insulated. Bundles of dry grass, hay, or even snow were placed there at the very base. This created an additional layer of insulation, turning the lower part of the teepee into a thick wall. The invention of the inner canopy was a turning point in the development of the plains. It allowed people not only to survive, but to live comfortably in these harsh lands all year round. It was a brilliant example of using the simplest laws of physics to solve the most complex problems of survival. Don't forget to like this if you are impressed by this ancient insulation technology. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us back to an era when ventilation was an art, not just a button on the wall? The most noticeable and important part of the upper structure of the teepee were two large smoke valves, often referred to as ears. These movable parts of the outer covering were located at the very top, around the smoke hole. They were not just a decorative element, but a complex and effective tool for controlling airflow and draft. These valves were controlled by two long poles located outside the dwelling. The lower ends of these poles rested on the ground, while the upper ends were inserted into special pockets at the corners of the valves. By moving the lower ends of the poles along the ground, it was possible to change the position of the valves at the top, opening or closing the smoke vent. The main purpose of this system was to use the force of the wind to draw smoke out of the dwelling. The valves were always installed so that the wind did not blow directly into the smoke vent, but tangentially to it. One valve was placed against the wind, serving as a barrier, and the second was opened downwind. The wind hitting the barrier valve flowed around it and created an area of low pressure directly above the smoke vent. This worked like a powerful pump, literally sucking smoke and stale air out of the dwelling. This ejection principle allowed for excellent draft even in light winds. If the wind changed direction, which happened constantly on the plains, the inhabitants of the teepee had to react immediately. They went outside and rearranged the poles, adjusting the position of the valves to the new wind direction. It was a constant job that required attention and understanding of weather conditions. In case of heavy rain or snowfall, the flaps could be completely closed by overlapping them. This sealed the top of the teepee, preventing precipitation from getting inside and flooding the fire. Of course, in this mode, the fire had to be extinguished or left with only smoldering coals so as not to suffocate from the smoke. Experienced plains dwellers could adjust the flaps so finely that even in a severe storm, it was warm and almost smoke-free inside the teepee. They knew the angles of inclination and the degree of opening of the flaps for any wind force. It was an art they learned from childhood by watching their elders. Incorrectly adjusted valves could turn life in the teepee into hell. The wind blowing into the smoke hole drove all the smoke back down, making it unbearable to stay inside. The cold air falling from above quickly cooled the dwelling, negating the work of the fire. This dynamic ventilation system was a unique solution, unparalleled in the architecture of other peoples. It allowed an open fire to be lit inside a relatively small enclosed space, effectively removing combustion products while retaining heat. This was the key to a comfortable winter. The smoke flaps of the tipis are a striking example of how the Indians did not fight the wind, but cooperated with it. They turned a force that could have made their dwelling uninhabitable into the main mechanism for sustaining life in it. In the next chapter, you will learn how the inhabitants of forest regions coped with this terrible weather. In the northeast of the continent, in the Great Lakes and forest region, conditions were different from those on the plains. Here, the winds were not as constant and fierce, but winter storms brought huge amounts of snow and strong gusts of wind. The peoples of the Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, built a completely different type of dwelling: longhouses. These were stationary, massive structures designed to house several related families, a kind of apartment building made of bark and wood. The longhouse was an arched structure. The frame was made of flexible young trees that were stuck into the ground in rows, and their tops were tied together to form an arch. This frame was incredibly elastic and durable. The arch shape, like the cone of a teepee, was excellent at withstanding wind loads, allowing the wind to flow smoothly over the building from above without creating areas of critical pressure. The outside of the frame was covered with large sheets of elm bark or other trees. The bark was laid overlapping like tiles and tightly tied to the frame. This cladding created a reliable, windproof, and waterproof shell. Unlike skins, the bark did not stretch from moisture, keeping the walls airtight in all weather conditions. The key to protection from the wind was the orientation of the longhouse. The Iroquois knew the wind patterns of their area very well. They tried to position their houses so that one end of the building faced the prevailing winter winds. The end wall had the smallest surface area compared to the long side walls. By exposing the narrow end to the wind, the builders minimized the overall wind load on the entire structure. If the wind had hit the long side wall, the risk of destruction or damage to the siding would have been much higher. The entrances to the longhouse were usually located in the end walls. To prevent cold wind from rushing in every time the door was opened, the Iroquois built a kind of vestibule. The entrance was covered with heavy skins on the outside and inside, creating an airlock. Inside the longhouse, the space was divided by a central passageway, along which the hearths were located. Each hearth heated two families living opposite each other in compartments along the walls. The smoke escaped through openings in the roof located directly above the hearths. These smoke vents also had a system to protect against wind and precipitation. These were usually movable pieces of bark that could be shifted with sticks from the inside, regulating the draft or closing the opening during a heavy storm. Although this system was less sophisticated than the TIA valves, it served the same function. The massiveness of the structure and the collective warmth of many people and hearths made the longhouse a reliable refuge. The thick layer of snow that covered the roof and walls in winter served as additional insulation, plugging all possible gaps. In winter, life inside these wooden whales was warm and safe. The longhouse was an example of a different strategy, not avoiding the wind, but creating a strong fortress capable of withstanding its force. It was the architecture of settled people who relied on the strength of materials and collective labor. Are you ready for the shocking truth that cold snow can not only freeze, but also effectively warm? In the harsh subarctic regions, where the Cree and Athabascan peoples lived for centuries, winters were much harsher than on the plains. The winds there were piercing, and temperatures dropped to extreme levels. In such conditions, snow itself often became the main building material for protection from death. The indigenous peoples of the North were well aware of the unique and life-saving insulating properties of snow cover. For them, it was not just frozen water, but a warm blanket covering the earth. The secret lies in physics. Snow consists of many ice crystals, with air trapped between them. And as we know, still air is the best natural insulator. In emergency situations, when a sudden blizzard caught a hunter far from his main dwelling, the ability to quickly create a shelter out of snow became a matter of life and death. There was no time to chop down trees or set up a tent. The simplest and quickest way to survive was to dig a cave in a deep snowdrift or dense snowdrift. Hunters used snowshoes or even their own hands in mittens to dig into the snow. The entrance to such a cave was always made strictly on the leeward side so that it would not be blown away or clogged with snow. In addition, The entrance was always located below the floor level of the living chamber itself. This clever entrance placement created a physical effect known as a cold trap. Heavy cold air from the street sank down and accumulated in the low area at the entrance, like water in a well. It could not penetrate upward into the main chamber where the person was located. At the same time, warm air from the person's breath or a tiny oil lamp rose upward. It lingered under the dome of the cave with no way out. Thanks to this, a comfortable above-zero temperature was created inside the snow bag. The thick walls of the snow shelter reliably protected the inhabitant from any wind, even hurricane force. No matter how fierce the storm outside, it was always quiet and peaceful inside the snow cave. The snow perfectly muffled sounds, creating a feeling of complete isolation from the chaos outside. Another type of temporary, but more reliable shelter was the quinzhee. This dome-shaped dwelling was not built in a snowdrift, but was created artificially from a large pile of snow. The snow was raked into a huge mound and given time to settle and harden in the frost. Then this pile was carefully dug out from the inside, removing excess snow through the entrance. This process took time and considerable physical effort, but the result was worth it. The result was a sturdy shelter with thick walls that eventually became as hard as stone. The snow walls of the quinzhee were completely impervious to winds of any strength. The body heat of the inhabitants melted the inner surface of the walls, creating an icy crust that retained heat even better. It was a real fortress in the middle of a snowy desert. To protect permanent dwellings or temporary camps from the wind, special snow walls were often erected as windbreaks. They were built on the windward side from carved blocks of dense snow or simply by raking up high mounds. Such an artificial barrier forced the wind to rise upward. The wind flew over the camp in an arc, creating a zone of relative calm and comfort behind the wall. This made it possible to build fires outside without fear of them being blown out. Snow was also used for additional insulation of the foundations of other types of dwellings, such as tipis and wigwams. In winter, the lower part of the perimeter was deliberately covered with a high and wide mound of snow. This created an airtight seal that prevented icy drafts from blowing across the floor. The snow mound acted as an additional layer of insulation in the most vulnerable area of the house. It was very important to be able to choose the right snow for construction, and the Indians were experts at this. Fresh, fluffy, and loose snow was completely unsuitable for this purpose. It was easily blown away by the wind, crumbled in the hands, and did not hold its shape well. The ideal snow was dense, wind-packed snow that could be cut into even blocks. These techniques for using snow were perfected by the peoples of the Arctic, but they were also widely used by their southern neighbors. In forest and steppe zones during deep snow winters, this knowledge saved thousands of lives. Instead of fighting the snow senselessly, the indigenous people wisely made it their ally. A snow wall was the best and most accessible windbreak to be found in the winter taiga. In the next chapter, you will learn how the earth itself helped the Indians hide from the elements. The ability to build a reliable shelter was only half the battle in protecting oneself from the wind. The other half, equally important, was the ability to choose the right location for it. Native Americans were unmatched masters at reading the landscape. They saw the terrain not just as hills and ravines, but as a complex system of wind tunnels, calm zones, and wind traps. Choosing a location for a winter camp was a strategic decision on which the survival of the entire tribe depended. Open, elevated places, ideal for summer camps because of their coolness and lack of insects, turned into deadly traps in winter. Here the wind reached its maximum strength, blowing away the heat and covering everything with snow. Therefore, tribes always migrated to more sheltered places for the winter. Deep river and stream valleys, especially those with high steep banks, were considered ideal shelters. These river valleys, or coulee as they were called on the plains, acted as natural trenches protecting against the wind. If the camp was located at the bottom of such a valley, the wind swept high above people's heads without affecting their dwellings. The high banks served as giant natural windbreaks. In addition, trees and shrubs usually grew in river valleys, providing fuel and additional protection. Places in river bends were especially valued, where the high bank formed a natural horseshoe shape, enclosing the camp on three sides. If such a horseshoe was open to the south or east, it was an ideal location. The north and west winds broke against the high banks, and the southern sun warmed the camp during the day, protecting it from cold currents. Forests and even narrow strips of trees along streams were also used as protection. Camps were never set up on the windward side of the forest, where the wind hitting the wall of trees created eddies and snowdrifts. The site was chosen on the leeward side, in the so-called wind shadow of the trees. The trees broke up the monolithic wind flow into many small, weak streams, significantly reducing its speed and force. Even small depressions in the terrain, ravines, lowlands, foothills, were used for temporary stops or for setting up single tipis. Travelers always looked for any depression to shelter from the direct force of the wind. The ability to find such micro-shelters was a key skill for hunters and warriors who were far from the main camp. When choosing a location, not only the current wind was taken into account, but also possible changes in the weather. Elders and experienced guides knew from signs in nature, the shape of clouds, the behavior of animals, the color of the sunset, where to expect the next storm. The camp was oriented so as to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. Mistakes in choosing a location were costly. A camp set up in the wind tunnel of a canyon or on a windswept plateau could be completely buried under snow overnight. People spent enormous amounts of energy clearing snow and keeping warm, instead of resting and doing crafts. Therefore, knowledge of good places was passed down from generation to generation. These places had been known to tribes for centuries and were used every winter. The landscape was not just a territory for them, but a map of safe areas drawn by nature itself. Using the natural terrain was the first and most extensive level of protection from the wind. Tipis, clothing, and fire were secondary means that worked within this natural fortress. It was a strategy of deep integration into the environment. When you are outside your home, the only barrier between you and the deadly wind is your clothing. Native Americans created clothing systems that were as windproof as modern high-tech membranes. The main material was, of course, animal skin: bison, deer, moose. Properly tanned leather has a unique property. It is completely windproof, but at the same time it is able to breathe, allowing body vapors to escape. The secret lay in the tanning method. For winter clothing, the leather was often smoked over rotten wood. This process not only gave the leather its characteristic color and smell, but also changed its structure. The smoke penetrated between the collagen fibers, making the leather soft, elastic, and water-repellent. Such leather did not stiffen in the cold and retained its protective properties even after getting wet and drying out. The cut of the clothing was designed to provide maximum protection for the body. Anorak jackets, which were pulled over the head, were widely used in the plains and the north. The absence of a front opening and fasteners prevented the chest and abdomen, the areas most vulnerable to the cold, from being exposed to the wind. The hood, often trimmed with wolverine or wolf fur, reliably protected the head and neck. The fur trim on the hood played an important aerodynamic role. The long, stiff fur bristles broke up the wind in front of the face, creating a zone of calm air directly in front of the eyes and nose. In addition, frost did not form on such fur from breathing, which was critical in severe frosts. The sleeves and trouser legs were made long enough and often had ties or cuffs to prevent cold air from reaching the wrists and ankles. Trousers, leggings, were often tucked into high moccasins. All seams between clothing items were carefully covered. The principle of layering was known to Native Americans long before the advent of modern theories of clothing. The bottom layer of clothing, made of soft, well-tanned suede, was worn directly on the body or over a loincloth. Its purpose was to wick moisture away from the skin. The top layer was a windproof shell made of thicker leather, often with fur on the outside or inside, depending on the weather. The space between the layers of clothing trapped warm air, working on the same principle as the double walls of a teepee. In the harshest frosts and storms, a large bison skin, or bison blanket, was thrown over all the clothing. This skin was worn with the fur on the inside, and its thick, windproof leather side was turned toward the wind. A person could wrap themselves completely in such a skin, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes, turning into a monolithic, wind-streamlined cocoon. Footwear, moccasins, was also part of the wind protection system. Winter moccasins were made of fur-lined leather and were tall, covering the shins. Dry grass or moss was stuffed inside for extra insulation and moisture absorption. The soft sole allowed the wearer to feel the ground and not slip. while the thick leather upper kept the wind from reaching the toes. This clothing was the result of thousands of years of natural selection. Every detail, every seam and tie had been tested by countless winters and blizzards. It was the perfect second skin, allowing people to live and work where any other clothing would have led to rapid death. Technology and knowledge were important, but psychology was an equally important factor in surviving prolonged winter storms. Indigenous peoples possessed a unique patience and ability to fall into a kind of hibernation when conditions outside became unbearable. They knew that fighting a storm at its peak was a sure way to perish. The main strategy was to conserve energy and heat. When a serious blizzard began, life in the camp came to a standstill. People took shelter in their tipis or houses, tightly closing the entrances and smoke vents, leaving only a minimal gap for ventilation. Activity was reduced to zero. No one went outside unless absolutely necessary, only to gather firewood if they ran out inside or to relieve themselves. Inside their dwellings, people spent most of their time sitting or lying under warm bison skins, huddled around the central hearth. The collective warmth of their bodies became an important addition to the heat of the fire. At such moments, personal space shrunk and survival became a collective act. Food also changed during these periods. Instead of fresh meat, which required long cooking times, they used pemmican, a high-calorie mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries. Pemmican could be eaten dry or quickly reheated with water to make a nutritious soup. This saved fuel and energy. The most important psychological aspect was the ability to wait without anxiety or panic. The storm could last several days and sometimes even a week. Europeans in such situations often began to panic, tried to break through the blizzard, or acted chaotically, wasting precious energy. The Indians, on the other hand, perceived the storm as an inevitable part of the natural cycle, which simply had to be endured, like the night before dawn. During this time, stories were told in homes, legends were passed on, and clothes and utensils were repaired. It was a time of forced rest, which was used to strengthen social ties and pass on knowledge to young people. The calmness of the adults was passed on to the children, preventing fear from taking hold of them. Special attention was paid to the state of the fire. It was constantly monitored, not allowing it to go out, but also not stoking it too much in order to save wood. The supply of wood was always kept inside the tipi, in a dry place at the entrance, so as not to go outside unnecessarily. If a storm caught a person on the road and they could not build a proper shelter, they used the same tactic. They wrapped themselves in skins, found at least some depression in the ground, lay down with their back to the wind, and waited. Covered with snow, they fell into a semi-sleep, lowering their metabolism and conserving heat. Many survived in such conditions, spending several days under the snow. It took deep trust in their skills, their clothing, and their bodies. They knew that humans can endure much more than it seems if they do not waste their strength on a futile struggle against the elements. This psychological resilience was as important a tool for survival as a flint knife or a bow. As soon as the storm subsided, the camp instantly came to life. The men went hunting to replenish their supplies of fresh meat, while the women cleared the snow and took care of the household. Life returned to normal until the next test of the wind. We have already talked at length and in detail about protection from icy winds and snowstorms. However, it would be a huge and gross mistake to assume that the Indians perceived this element exclusively as their worst enemy. In their deep and wise worldview, there were no unequivocally bad or good phenomena of nature. For them, the wind was a powerful living force and even a separate spirit. It was possible and necessary to constantly interact with this spirit, to negotiate with it and live in peace. And in certain situations, this fierce force was transformed from a deadly threat into an indispensable and faithful helper to humans. Successful hunting on the endless plains would be simply impossible without constant and competent consideration of the wind direction. Bison and other wild ungulates have a phenomenal sense of smell that far exceeds that of humans. They can smell a hunter from many kilometers away, even without seeing him in the tall grass. Therefore, an experienced hunter always began his approach to the herd strictly from the leeward side. The wind had to carry his scent away from the sensitive noses of the animals into the empty steppe. In this case, the wind acted as the best natural camouflage. It hid the presence of a person much more reliably than any bushes or artificial shelters. During large-scale drive hunts, the wind was cleverly used to control the movement of huge herds. Animals instinctively always try to move against the wind in order to sense danger ahead of them. Knowing this biological feature, the drivers could skillfully direct the flow of animals in the direction they wanted. They drove the bison to a steep cliff or into a prepared ambush simply by manipulating their position relative to the wind in the herd. Hunters played on the instincts of the animals, forcing the wind to work as a shepherd. Without this factor, it would have been incredibly difficult to drive wild bulls. The wind was also critically important in the harsh military affairs of the steppe tribes. Sudden night attacks on enemy camps were very often planned with careful consideration of the current wind direction. A well-executed attack from the leeward side allowed scouts to get close to the enemy unnoticed. The wind reliably carried away the sounds of movement, the creaking of harnesses, and the smells of the sweaty bodies of the attacking warriors. Even the sensitive camp dogs that guarded the tribe's sleep often could not smell the approaching threat until the very last moment. Nature itself hid the traces of the attackers. The most terrifying and destructive weapon of the plains, in which the wind played a major role, was man-made steppe fires. The Indians masterfully and ruthlessly used fire for both hunting and warfare. By setting fire to dry, tall grass on the windward side, they created a giant wall of roaring fire. This wall of fire rushed at the enemy or a herd of animals at tremendous speed, driven by strong winds. It was almost impossible to escape such flames, as they moved faster than a horse. It was a scorched earth tactic in the most literal sense. Such an artificial firestorm was absolutely unstoppable and swept away everything in its path. It could burn huge areas, depriving the enemy of pasture for their horses for the entire season and condemning them to starvation. The fire could also drive frightened bison into a narrow trap where hunters were waiting for them. The ability to control such a fire, started at the right time, and direct it correctly required real skill. This required a deep knowledge of local winds and terrain features so that the fire would not turn against the arsonists themselves. A mistake could cost the tribe its very life. In peaceful everyday life, the wind also found wide application and was useful to housewives. It was actively used for food preparation, in particular for drying meat and forest berries. Bison meat, cut into thin, long strips, was hung on special wooden hangers in an open place. The dry and hot steppe wind quickly removed excess moisture from the fibers. It turned the meat into a nutritious product that could be stored for a long time before it had a chance to spoil in the heat. Tanned hides were dried in exactly the same way after tanning. Thus, the relationship between Native Americans and the wind was much more complex and multifaceted than it seems at first glance. It was not a simple, one-sided, deft defense against the elements. It was a constant, dynamic interaction, like a dance with a powerful and dangerous partner. They deeply respected the invisible power of the wind and feared its destructive wrath. But at the same time, they knew how to masterfully use its power to their advantage whenever possible. The wind was as much a tool to them as a bow or an axe. This amazing ability to see in nature not only a deadly threat, but also a hidden opportunity, was the foundation of their civilization. They never tried to brutally subdue nature or remake it for themselves. They lived within it, wisely using its eternal laws for their prosperity and survival. The story of the survival of the indigenous peoples of North America is not just a story of struggling against the cold. It is a story of a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the aerodynamics and physics of the environment. They realized the main truth of the plains in the north. Stationary cold can be endured, but moving cold, wind, is an active enemy that requires special protective measures. Their entire material culture, from the construction of their dwellings to the cut of their clothing, was a response to this challenge. We saw how the asymmetrical shape of the teepee forced hurricane-force winds to flow around the dwelling without destroying it. We learned the secret of the inner canopy, which created a thermal air cushion, and the ingenious system of smoke vents that used the force of the wind for ventilation. We examined how the Iroquois built their forest fortresses, orienting them with their ends toward the storm, and how the peoples of the north used snow itself as the best insulation. But protection was not only technological. The ability to read the landscape and find natural windbreaks in river valleys was a strategic skill. Smoked leather clothing became a second, windproof skin for humans, and psychological resilience and the ability to wait out the storm in a state of calm were no less important than the strength of the teepee poles. Moreover, these people learned to turn the wind from an enemy into an ally. They used it to hide their scent while hunting, to control the movement of bison herds, to dry meat, and even as a weapon in the form of prairie fires. Their attitude toward the wind was not that of a fearful victim, but of respect for an equal partner. This experience of adapting to extreme conditions, accumulated over millennia, is still relevant today. Modern architects and clothing designers are still studying the principles behind the construction of teepees and traditional clothing, finding in them ingenious solutions to the problems of heat conservation and ventilation. This legacy reminds us that the most effective solutions are often based not on fighting nature, but on understanding its laws and knowing how to work with them. If you enjoyed learning about the engineering and survival secrets of Native Americans and would like to see more in-depth historical insights like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. What other aspects of the lives of the Great Plains Indians would you like us to cover in future episodes? Please share your suggestions in the comments.